Houston, we've had a problem. Got a fire in the cockpit.
These creepy audios were recorded by astronauts during the Apollo space missions. NASA informs us about the scientific discoveries that have been made thanks to this project, and of course, about the main achievement, landing a human on the moon. But what NASA doesn't like to talk about is that what cost they did it. Flying into space is a difficult task, but what is even more difficult is to return from there alive. So what were the most dangerous Apollo missions? The morning of July 16, 1969. An American astronaut, Buzz Aldrin, puts a tiny bowl, breadcrumbs, and a handwritten Bible, first postcard, into a small vacuum bag. Very soon, he will accomplish what no one has ever done before him in the history of humankind. Keel damp onto the moon's surface is part of the Apollo 11 mission. But this isn't Buzz's first time in space. As a member of the Apollo 8 crew, he's already completed a human crewed orbital flight to the moon. The first 10 Apollo projects focused on testing spacecraft, developing technology for spaceflight, and training the astronauts. However, this time, Buzz and his partner, Commander Neil Armstrong, were supposed to land on the moon for the first time, not just observe it from afar. Team of 4,000 people spent several decades developing this flight in. Buzz Aldrin himself spent 2 years training thus. The astronaut was utterly sure of the mission's success and didn't worry at all. He put the bag he just collected in his pocket and went to work, not even suspecting that he would have to go through all the circles of hell. The launch of the Saturn V launch vehicle was broadcast live on TV in 33 countries, on 6 continents. In the United States alone, about 25 million viewers watched it. So at the time of launch, Buzz Aldrin felt the euphoria of all rock stars combined. After a successful takeoff, it took the astronauts 3 days to reach their destination. And now this long-awaited moment came. The lunar module detached from the command module and was about to land on the moon. Suddenly Aldrin saw that the navigator flashed the 1202 alarm. The command center reported that the computer was overloaded with tasks, and the navigation system couldn't cope. The module where the astronauts were began to sharply change the trajectory towards a dangerous rocky area. Captain Neil Armstrong decided to act immediately and to manual control. The fuel gauge readings were alarmingly low, and the rocket engine kicked up space dust that obscured the view. Even though they were about to crash, Buzz didn't doubt his partner for a second. And he was right. Neil managed to successfully land the module. The right to be the first to set foot on the moon's surface was granted to the ship's captain. Aldrin had to go down after him. He didn't even suspect that this would become his stigma for life. At all important events, he'll be called the second man on the moon, the legendary Colonel Buzz Aldrin. Although Buzz was a supporter of the scientific approach to understanding the world, he still believed in God. That's why he brought the communion kit to the ship. Is Armstrong prepared to leave? Aldrin drank a drop of wine from a tiny bowl, ate breadcrumbs, and read a passage from the Bible. And only after that did he put on a space suit and leave the module. At that moment, it even seemed to him that he smelled the moment, which reminded him of wet ashes. At that moment, the astronaut realized that he hadn't prepared any great speeches for such a historic moment. Unlike Neil and his legendary phrase,
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
So Aldrin just said, "Magnificent desolation." On the moon's surface, the team collected soil samples, took many photos, and placed the equipment necessary for further research. In the middle of the mission, Buzz heard a radio signal through his earpiece, informing him about some sudden, important call. The astronaut sensed something was wrong. It turns out that the center discovered some kind of breakdown in the system, and they'll now be notified that they'll have to stay on the moon forever. But as it turned out, U.S. President Richard Nixon himself got through to them. On the moon, he asked about the astronauts' success and well-being, said, "They became the most famous people on Earth." After these words, Buzz planted a U.S. flag on the moon and left small presents with Neil. These were postage stamps, coins, an aluminum plate with a symbolic message for other civilizations, and most importantly, the Apollo 1 team commemorative medal. After 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon, was time to head back. The astronauts successfully took off and docked with the command module. But during the return to Earth, real danger waited them. After the astronauts' council passed through the atmosphere and landed in the Pacific Ocean, Buzz noticed that his feet were getting wet. It turned out that the module was depressurized after the fall, and water poured into it. Buzz thought how funny it would be to drown in the ocean after having completed such a dangerous journey to the moon and back, that the rescue team quickly responded and promptly delivered a helicopter to the sea, which could lift the astronauts, and the council bus was very lucky because not only did he survive, but he also completed all the tasks of the mission. Unfortunately, this wasn't possible for the Apollo 12 astronauts. November 14, 1969. The spaceport at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The commander, Charles Conrad, looked out the window of the Kennedy Space Center. He saw the sky become overcast. It was raining. A strong wind was blowing. And in general, weather is getting worse. This could have disrupted the second ever flight to the moon and postponed it for another month. The crowd that gathered to watch the launch was much smaller than the one that had come to watch Apollo 11 for months earlier, but Conrad was informed that there was someone very important in this crowd. President Richard Nixon himself. Because of him, the controllers decided not to wait for the weather to improve, carry out the launch when they had planned. And that was a huge mistake. At 11:22 a.m. local time, the Saturn V rocket, with Charles Pete Conrad out and Richard Gordon on board, took off into the overcast sky. But 36 seconds later, a flash of white lights surrounded it. Dozens of warning lights lit up in the cockpit. At the same time, although the crew worked out every conceivable scenario during training, none of them had ever seen so many malfunction warnings fired simultaneously. Another 16 seconds after the first flash, the second one came. Conrad tried to look at the buttons on the dashboard but was completely off. The captain had only a few minutes to decide to abort the flight. Despite everything, Apollo 12 was still flying in the right direction. Conrad was very hesitant about whether he should risk his life and the lives of his colleagues. And then props from the engineers began to come into his earpiece. He had to immediately find the switch and restart the panel. Conrad was furious because every second mattered. And because of the panic, he couldn't cope. Suddenly his colleague, Gallon, being intervened. He quickly found it, flipped the switch, and the panel lit up again. The mission was saved. But for how long? The next problem was not long and coming, and was associated with the rocket stages. They were designed so that each next stage separated from the previous one after its fuel supply was depleted. But due to the problems at the start, one of the stages detached later than it should have. As a result, it ended up in the moon's orbit instead of flying into outer space. It could become an obstacle to subsequent missions. The astronauts at that moment couldn't even imagine this part of the ship would wander in space for over 30 years, until a group of amateur astronomers noticed it in 2002. The problems didn't end there. During the landing on the moon, a malfunction was discovered in one of the engines. With great difficulty, the team managed to land the module with minimal damage. Command center controllers were on edge. But the failures of Apollo 12 didn't end there. Conrad's first line on the moon was, the main center was dumbfounded, because every word of the astronauts on the moon entered history. But the thing is that before the flight, Conrad had made a bet with the reporter, Oriana Flancy, for $500, that NASA didn't write the text for the astronauts. Though it wasn't the only funny thing. During the Apollo 12 mission, the astronauts brought Playboy images on board and took pictures with them on the moon. And when Conrad had to step on the moon's surface for the first time, he stumbled and fell. At that moment, the astronaut probably felt reassured that the whole world wouldn't see such an epic fall. You see, the astronauts had accidentally damaged the antenna of a color camera that was supposed to broadcast all their actions. This whole mission resembled a typical horror movie, when a group of friends is having fun and joking around, while the intense music behind the scene makes the viewer understand that these guys are in danger they haven't sensed yet. While Conrad and his colleagues were absolutely calm, things were much more stressful in the Mission Control Center. The white flash that nearly ruined the whole mission in the first seconds of the flight was lightning. So due to the malfunctions caused by its impact, teams' landing parachutes could open too early. No one knew for sure if they would work properly, or if the entire crew would fall. Unable to fix this issue, NASA decided to hide this information from the astronauts. Fortunately, during the flight back to Earth, the parachutes opened precisely on cue. It also turned out that, in addition to the problems with the video camera, the astronauts had lost several film magazines, while some of the remaining ones got damaged. This was a real blow to scientists who hoped to study satellite images. Besides, some TV channels had already sold ads that were supposed to play during the live broadcast of the first color images from the moon. Alas, there was nothing to show, and it actually threatened any further funding for the project. Still, even this flawed mission cannot be compared to what happened to Apollo 13. John Nairn was having a rest after a long shift at the Mission Control Center. Along with other NASA employees, he worked day and night for more than a year to launch the Apollo 13 mission, during which astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were supposed to set foot on the moon, just like their predecessors. Fortunately, the rocket launch went off without any problems. NASA team worked round the clock to support the crew and avoid repeating past mistakes, and now John could finally relax. But suddenly, the phone rang. John picked up the phone and heard the familiar voice of his colleague from the Mission Control Center. It sounded pretty nervous apparently. An oxygen tank exploded in the service module, the Apollo 13 rocket, and the astronauts were gradually losing air. John felt his heart skip a beat. In his short time at NASA, he gained a reputation as a technical genius who could quickly figure out a complex problem. John immediately turned on the recording of the conversation with the team and heard the now famous phrase,
Houston, we've had a problem.
At that same moment, alarm lamps lit up in the Mission Control Center, signaling power outages on the ship. It wasn't until later that the NASA Accident Investigation Board found that, on that fateful day, a spark from a bare wire in an oxygen tank started a fire, rupturing one oxygen tank and damaging another. Since oxygen also fed the fuel elements of the Odyssey command module, where the astronauts were located, the aircraft's power also decreased. But at that moment, John didn't know that. He understood that every second of his doubts could cost the lives of 3 astronauts. After considering all options for emergency rescue, the engineer faced a serious dilemma. The thing was that a limited amount of oxygen remained on board, and the supply of fuel needed to return to Earth also decreased. Landing on the moon was out of the question, so they had only 2 options. First, they could return to Earth on a damaged module, using their remaining resources and limited power supply, but risking their lives. Second, the astronauts could use the Apollo lunar module, Aquarius, designed to land on the moon. In the end, the second option was chosen. Yet a new peril emerged. After redirecting the mission to return home, it was necessary to recalculate the flight path. It could pretty much lead to the astronauts simply getting lost in space. Still, it was worth the risk. The astronauts felt uncomfortable in Aquarius because it was designed solely for 2 people to fly in at, while the third would wait for their return. During the flight, the temperature in the cockpit quickly dropped to near zero. Some foodstuffs had become inedible. So the hungry astronauts stay in a cold, cramped module with a limited supply of oxygen for about 90 hours. During that time, Fred Hayes developed chills, a bladder infection, plus on top of the stress, the astronauts were exhausted because of the lack of sleep during those 6 days of flight. At that time, John and the Flight Center team also kept their eyes open, drafting a plan to get the spacecraft on the right trajectory. Ultimately, they managed to bring the astronauts home. They were saved thanks to their own self-composure. The flight control team, and of course John Aaron. Complex challenges fall not only upon astronauts in space, but also upon regular NASA employees controlling the flight from Earth. After that incident, numerous changes were made to the design of the service and command modules for greater security. Thus 12 Apollo astronauts have walked on the moon throughout history. But none of this would have happened if not for the very first, and at the same time, the most tragic, first mission. 1967 NASA's top test pilot, Gus Grissom, went hunting with his 13-year-old son Mark. It was their favorite thing to do together. But on that day, the always cheerful Gus was somehow tense. He expressed his concerns about the upcoming flight. But the pilot still didn't stop joking around, and told his wife, "Daddy, if I die, have a party." At the same time, an experienced astronaut, Ed White, again carved something out of wood. Before work, had fun talking to his 14-year-old son Edward, and watched his 7-year-old daughter Bonnie practice with the balance beam he made with his own hands. At that moment, Roger Chaffee was swimming with his 8-year-old daughter Cheryl in the pool, looking forward to the next step in his career. As an astronaut, all of them were selected for the Power 1 mission. The team was supposed to make the first human crewed flight on a spaceship. It was a crazy technological race between the USSR and the USA. The latter had already fallen behind because it was a Soviet astronaut who became the first human in that space. Naturally, NASA wanted to respond by sending their astronauts straight to the moon, so the astronauts did their best to prepare for the flight, which was to take place almost a month later. On January 27th, according to the plan, they were supposed to have a training launch. The crew was already in place, and NASA workers turned on the countdown. Suddenly Grissom smelled sulfur, which could indicate a gas leak. Countdown was immediately stopped. Gus was very annoyed that things were starting to go wrong. When technicians fixed the issue by filling the module with 100% oxygen, the odor dissipated. The countdown resumed. Here Grissom was furious again because there were communication problems between the crew, the administrative building, and the checkpoint of the launch complex. The astronaut was outraged.
Hey, how are we gonna get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings?
Tired of dealing with communication problems, most dispatchers left their office to take a break. Except one of them, and all of a sudden, that dispatcher heard some weird noise, followed by white screams. Then more screams were heard, until there was only silence left. Little Mark Grissom was playing near the house when a neighbor's child said he was urgently called home. He said something had happened at work to Mark's dad. Ed White came home on a bike after football and saw Neil Armstrong's wife, who lived next door. From her expression, he understood everything. Cheryl Chaffee's mom came into her daughter's room completely pale and said, "Daddy won't come home again." Cheryl scarily asked, "Are you getting a divorce?" And her mother burst into tears. During the test launch, a fire suddenly broke out in the cockpit of Apollo 1. Ed White was desperately trying to open the inner hatch, but it was designed so that it could only be opened from the outside. The astronauts had no chance. All 3 died. An examination showed that death was caused not by the fire itself, but by poisoning with carbon monoxide and other toxic gases produced by the fire. Such an unexpected tragedy struck not only the astronauts' families, but also the whole of America. After that incident, NASA revised the security measures and replaced the capsule hatch with one that would quickly open outward and the spacecraft cockpit atmosphere was changed from 100% oxygen to a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. To this day, the Moon is a commemorative medal left by the astronauts of Apollo 11, dedicated to their colleagues from the very first mission. It has been 51 years since a human has set foot on the Moon's surface. Apollo 17, the final mission of NASA's Apollo program, went into space back in 1972. But NASA announces that it's once again preparing to send a human to the Moon in 2025 or 2026. Would you dare to become an astronaut indeed? On the one hand, everything can go wrong at any mission stage. On the other hand, everything can go according to plan. And you might also have a chance to walk on the Moon. Write your thoughts in the comments.